Welcome to this webinar today. This is one of the webinars that we do regularly, and one that we're doing in the new series called Conversations Across Borders, where we talk to people in different parts of Europe and indeed in different parts of the world about some of the problems that we have in common. And we thought we'd do this one, where it's sort of a hostage to fortune here. We do this one on post-Brexit and how it's going to affect Europe, how it's going to affect Great Britain and its impact on the globe as well, and how we expect things to develop. I mean, if we know that, there's still so much uncertainty. Anyhow, we're going to sort of dive into that uncertainty and see what we can get out of it. And we've got with us today two other people, Nerina Finetto, who's helping us do the Conversations Across Borders. We're doing it in partnership with her. And we've got Rickard Ydrenäs. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. You tell me if I haven't, but he's joining us as well. And he does a lot of podcasts around the whole issue of Brexit. So, welcome both of you today. Now I'm going to hand over to Nerina to start because she's going to lead this and we're going to have a sort of conversation. So Nerina, over to you.
Thank you so much, Rickard. Francis, really happy to be here and welcome, Rickard. Really happy to have you with us today. And we can start with you. You have started a podcast about Brexit. Why did you do it, and what kind of topics have you been speaking about during the last 2 years?
Thank you. I'm very happy to be joining in your podcast live and Facebook. I started Brexit Podden in 2017 in March, because I felt that there was so little discussion about this very important issue, Brexit, in the Swedish media. A lot of focus was and still is on Trump and American politics, but less on our relationship with the EU and the relationship with the UK and the big issue of Brexit and how it will affect Sweden, both us as a private persons, but also Swedish businesses that do trading with UK.
And when after the general elections in December, it looks really like that UK is heading to a withdrawal at the end of January. Francis, how were the reactions and how is the situation in Sweden now? And for you then, Rickard, how were the reactions in Sweden, and how is the situation now in your opinion?
I mean, we could talk about the situation in the UK and no one quite knows how it's going to sort of bear out in the future. One of the things that we do know is that what Brexit has done in the UK, and I think it's done it in the rest of Europe as well, it's exposed a lot of divisions that already existed. It became the catalyst for for opening up Pandora's box. And, dealing with those tensions are going to be one of the big problems of the next few years. Now we can go into those in a moment, but clearly there are divisions that politicians and everyone else, and particularly politicians, did not address for years. And Brexit has brought that out into the open. And it's not just Brexit that's doing it, it's many other things as well. So it's a real deep-seated problem.
Rickard, and you mentioned that you started exactly this podcast because in Sweden, for example, we did not speak about that much. How was the reaction after December?
Yes, I talked with some companies, and of course there is a relief now. Now we will know that what will happen. We know now that will be a Brexit. We don't know the consequences yet because we don't know what kind of, for example, customs arrangement that the UK will have with the EU. But it's a relief now. We know that there will be a Brexit, even if you don't like it. Most companies and people in Sweden don't like the Brexit because we have a very close cooperation with the UK in the EU, and UK is a close ally to Sweden. So we are happy now that we know what will happen, but we are sad that the UK is leaving the EU.
You mentioned this insecurity and security, and so the wish to find a way somehow. Francis, how and why do you think that Boris Johnson were able to win? Why did it make it?
I think that's a question a lot of people are asking. You got to remember the number of reasons why we won. First, we have a first past the post system. We don't have a proportional representation system. And that means with just over 40% of the votes, indeed, even with mid 30%, you can get a majority in the House of Commons. So that was one thing. The other thing is, I think that they really concentrated on the message, get Brexit done. And someone said that if people forget everything about the president election, the 2019 election, they will remember that phrase. He distilled the election into a simple message, which the Labour Party didn't do. And that, I think, was very, very successful electioneering. And the Labour Party, I think, was in a mess. They came out with a huge manifesto of promises, all at the last minute, one after the other. And people were not quite sure whether they could deliver. And the trust in politicians, the distrust in politicians was increased because there was promise after promise after promise. Good manifesto, but people didn't really think they could achieve it. So I think Boris Johnson won on the basis of that. And also the feeling, gosh, we've had this for 2 years. We want to get it over one way or the other and then move on.
Yes, and when assuming that the European Parliament is going to give the green light, and the UK is going to leave at the end of January, but it is going to be only the next step in the Brexit process, because then they are going to enter in this transition period of 1 year where they have to deal a new trade. And Francis, and we can start with you, Rickard. What do you think are the challenges here?
The challenges is, of course, that it is very short time that we have this transition period. It's supposed to end since Brexit was postponed from 31st of March and then postponed again now to October and then again to January. The transition period has been very shortened. So it's very short, it's the end of December, and that is, of course, how to handle and negotiate a trade deal that is complicated in such a short time. How will that happen? That's everyone asking now. And what will be the consequences of this trade deal? Will Boris Johnson succeed, and how tough will EU be in these negotiations? That's on top of my mind on this.
And Rickard, and what are, in your opinion, the most important or most difficult sectors and topics?
Usually in this kind of trade negotiations is fishery policy is one of the topics that is very difficult. Agricultural policies, those policies that are very demanding and breaking into areas that we have strong national interests. So I think that will be very tough. Of course, focus will be on the areas on customs and trade. That's our key for both UK and European businesses. Sweden have a lot of trade with the UK, and for Swedish companies, the best is, of course, if it is more or less business as usual, that it is no big changes. But this is, of course, a lot to do. How will the UK customs services, what will they decide on? What kind of documents, administrative documents that you need when you're clearing your products over the border? So we are going into an intense phase now and very difficult negotiations.
And Francis, what do you think are the lessons learned from, when we can say then, the politicians in your country? Also, are they going to be able to go into this trade deal in another way, or what are you expecting?
I don't know what I'm expecting, and I don't think anyone knows what they're expecting, and that's the problem. You know, I think there are sensitive areas. I mean, fisheries and agriculture clearly are two of them, but environmental issues, workers' rights, pollution, and so on is another area. And the problem is we've got 11 months to negotiate it, and take something like fisheries, that takes much, much longer in that, because, you know, the politicians agree the sort of baseline, and from there they go into the industrial discussion. That takes a long, long time. And Boris Johnson is saying, we want this concluded by the end of December this year. And, you know, if we don't, then, well, who knows? We may be out of the EU without any agreement, and we may be then trading on world WTO, World Trade Organization basis, which, you know, is something that frightens many, many people in this country. People want to deal. We could even remain in the EU, who knows? You know, the debate on Brexit is not over. We've just been through the very first stage. The next stage is going to be even more difficult. And I think many of us believe that Boris Johnson doesn't really understand how difficult it's going to be. And I think that's a problem that we have to come to terms with.
Yes, the UK got a new government, but actually the election results spoke really about a divided country. How are you dealing with this?
I don't think we are dealing with it. I mean, I think there are three divisions, three problems that we face, and Europe as well. I mean, one is that Brexit has shown, I mean, I live in London, I live in Enfield in North London, and London and Enfield is a Remain territory. They wanted to stay in, but in the north of England, they voted in many places overwhelmingly to leave. Partly that's because the north of England feels neglected. Over many, many years, they've seen industry, steel industry, shipping industry, the coal mining industry decline. Their communities have disintegrated, and they felt left behind. And Brexit gave them a chance to actually revolt against that. And that's one problem that has to be solved. The other problem is the generational conflict. Young people voted overwhelmingly to remain. Older people voted overwhelmingly to leave. And so we have a huge, you know, generational conflict of expectation and wanting things to remain the same. And then we have the problem of migration that all of Europe faces, and we've handled that really badly in the UK. We've had migration, and instead of having multiculturalism, we've had silo-culturalism, where, you know, migrant communities have been placed in almost silo ghettos, and people aren't meeting and integrating together and talking together and having the dialogue they should. So those three problems are the problems that Brexit has brought up. And if we don't resolve those, you know, just resolving Brexit is not enough.
And Rickard, this, what kind of lessons should the EU learn from the situation in the UK? So Brexit is not only, of course, a UK problem, but this is an EU problem.
Yes, I agree, and I agree with what Francis has said. I think lesson has to be learned that EU has to be better to communicate with its citizens on the benefits of EU membership. You talk often about these kitchen table arguments that you can use when you discuss EU with your family, that EU has to have better kitchen table arguments for all citizens in Europe, and the citizens in the EU in particular. And of course, I think how to make the EU more democratic, how to make EU more legitimate is very key. And also, how is media covering EU issues? I started my podcast about Brexit because I felt that the traditional media in Sweden did not cover Brexit as good as they could. And since it's such an important issue for both people living in the UK, we have over 100,000 Swedes living in London and in the UK, mainly in London. How will they be affected by Brexit? This has been discussed much more lately when we realized that there will be a Brexit, but in traditional media. But I think EU and national media has to be much better on communicating from the Brussels what is happening in the legislation and how it affects normal people and in their lives.
Yeah, I mean, can I sort of add to that? I mean, I think that's right. I think one of the problems that Europe has had is that it hasn't communicated well, but not only has it not communicated well, it's not organized itself well. There's been a tension between the sort of German and the French view of what Europe should be. They've tried to, you know, sort of stick together, but the French want a more centralized Europe, which is, you know, their tradition of bureaucracy. You know, the more you expand Europe, then the bigger the pressures of decentralization become, because not everybody wants to go on the same journey. And France and Germany have tried to get everyone to go on the same journey. And they're going to have to come to a new accommodation of a sort of confederation of different interests rather than this centralized bureaucratic model, which they developed over the years. And that's where reform's got to be. And they've got to devolve much, much more decision-making to nation states and to communities than they have. France tends to want to have everything centralized. And I think that's one of the big problems with Britain. They don't like that sort of, you know, centralization. So I think, you know, if you're going to expand, you won't be able to expand on a very bureaucratic centralized model. And I don't think Europe has really learned that yet.
Yes, this is the question is also what kind of role is the business community playing in this? So it is a political situation, but it is also an economic situation. What do you think about this, Rickard?
Of course, I think for the big companies, that is what the impression I have when talking to different companies. And I have a podcast about custom services also, Tullpodden, where we talk a lot about how customs are affected by Brexit. That big companies, large companies, are prepared for Brexit, but medium-sized and small companies are not prepared, and they have to do the lessons. I think also one comment is that for Sweden, we're losing our political influence since there are few countries that are in the EU but outside the EMU, outside the Euro. So the question is for Sweden and for Denmark, for example, how will we join the Euro in the long run? To gain political influence that we lose as a result of Brexit. And that is also a big shift in democracy. The central bank in Sweden will lose its power and it will be centralized to ECB in Frankfurt. So the question for businesses in Sweden is, how can Sweden be outside Euro in the long run for 5-10 years? And I think the answer is, it depends on what will be the effects of Brexit. It's a bit too early to say.
Yeah, this is even the question: is the Brexit the start of a long series of countries leaving, or is the start of a retraction and rebuilding of the EU? What do you think, Francis?
Well, okay.
I mean, that's a big question. I don't think anyone knows that yet. There are real pressures in some countries now to leave the EU. There's a Brexit in France. There's a strong movement there. Spain and Italy have shown some resistance to you know, the growth of the European Union is at the moment. And the whole of Eastern Europe has a very different view of what Europe should be. And then you have underneath of all that, the growth of populism, the growth of nationalist particularism coming up, where people are saying, we want to control our own destiny. We don't want it from top down. And so how all those forces play out against the need for intergovernmental decision-making because of the huge, big areas we have to face in the next 10 years, like climate change and pollution and so on, which demands people working together. These two forces, particularism and internationalism, are going to really play out. And I don't think anyone quite knows at the moment which of those are going to win out.
And Rickard, what do you think?
Can you repeat the question again?
Do you think that Brexit is going to be the start of a series of countries leaving the EU, or it is going to be the start of new moments for a better EU?
Well, I think that there will be no interest now to follow the path of the UK, since it has been so chaotic and so creating so much uncertainty. I think that this shows how difficult this process, Brexit, shows how difficult it is to leave the EU and leave with a good deal. I mean, Theresa May's deal was voted down I don't know how many times, and the new deal is not much difference from the old deal that she made. So Johnson made some small changes, and then he pushed it through. He was a better politician and a better strategic person, I think, in handling the Brexit. So I don't think that there will be more countries following. But I agree with Francis that nationalistic parties, populistic parties, can get stronger as a result of Brexit, and that in the long run this will have impact on European politics. How? It's very difficult to predict.
Yes, in one of your podcasts you mentioned that you asked the big question: what if Brexit is a success for the UK? What if it turns out as a positive change in the UK? What if?
Yes, then some countries might be. But the interesting thing is that, for example, in Sweden, if you look at the opinion polls, there is more people now that is positive to the EU project than before Brexit. So the support for the EU has increased in Sweden. So that's an interesting aspect of this, I think.
And Francis, what is happening with the amount of people in the UK that do not want to leave the UK, the EU, of course?
Well, they're feeling pretty sore at the moment, and can't quite believe what's hit them. But I think that there are some people that are hoping that it will still remain. There are some people that are hoping that we will rejoin at some point. But I think there's a growing number of people, and the number of organisations that are looking at as well at how we can have a new and a different type of Europe. We've talked to some people it's called Europe Future Fringe, I think. A number of organisations have got together and said the future of Europe really depends not upon politicians so much, because they don't actually know any more than we do. They're in a state of confusion about what's going to happen. And what we've got to do is galvanize civil society throughout Europe, get involved with community groups and citizens and organizations, and build Europe again from the bottom up. Now, I think there's a growing movement to do that, and a number of people are very interested in that. It's about the renewal of Europe, not in a sort of bureaucratic way, but in a sort of bottom-up democratic way. And I think those people who are disappointed with what's happened with Brexit can get some hope out of the fact that if we work together in civil society, we might be able to change, we might be able to achieve something positive.
You mentioned it already before, Francis, that there are somehow a big difference between also generations, also from people older and younger people. And if we look at the movement like the climate movement and other movements, also the people engaged with in the cleaning of the ocean, for example, there is a hope that it's going to be like a political situation, but at the same way a cultural development, that it's different. How do you think about this?
I think there will be a sort of cultural change. If you sort of look at the next 10 years, I mean, the big issue is not going to be Brexit. And it's not going to be a number of other things that we might think are the big issue. The big issue is going to be climate change. It's going to be whether in the next 10 years we have a planet that people can live on at the end of this century or not. And the younger generation are getting unbelievably involved in that. And they know that in order to achieve that, we've got to work together. And young people are sort of pressing their governments in a way that, we didn't think possible 2 years ago. So I think that sort of climate change imperative is going to change politics dramatically in the next 10 years. And it's going to change the way people behave in Europe. It's going to make people think about how we can work together more. So culturally, I think there is a lot of hope to achieve that. Whether we achieve it in time in terms of climate change, I don't know, but it will be a force for a more integrative rather than a more separatist effort.
And Rickard, if we think about the future, a short term, 2 years, a little bit longer perspective, like 10 years, what do you think that it's going to look like, and what do you wish we would think more about or speak more about?
Yes, I agree with Francis. I mean, the environmental issues are very important, and Greta Thunberg has made her name. She's come from Sweden and is one of the most well-known Swedes in Sweden and abroad in the whole world. And so I think EU will focus on the environmental issues. Totally agree with Francis. But I also think that since now the UK is leaving, there will be a big hole in the EU budget. So the question is, how should you fill this hole? Should the EU have a right to taxation, or is there other ways of filling the hole? Do the EU have to save on some areas money in order to have a budget in balance? I think that will be a real big demand now to solve this issue, a big challenge for Ursula von der Leyen, the new EU Commission chief. So EU has a lot of challenges ahead of it, and Brexit doesn't help. There will be a lack of money now when EU is going in for the next budget, 5-year budget.
And Francis, how is your short and long-term perspective, and what should we speak more about?
Well, I mean, I mentioned it. I think the climate change is the thing that's going to shape our long-term perspective. But all the other things that I mentioned earlier about how we've left communities behind, we've got to look at, because if we don't deal with that, another Brexit of a different kind is going to emerge in the future, where people are going to, support populist parties because they feel that's the way they get their voice heard. We're going to have to deal with a generational conflict, and we're going to have to work about how we can have more cohesion in society by bringing people from different cultures together and not, separating them out into ghettos and silos. And I think Brexit, if you want a positive thing that's come from it, it's a realization that we've got to deal with those problems. We've been ignoring them for so long. So Brexit could be the positive spur to dealing with those. It's not a nice positive spur, and there are lots of negatives about it, but at least it's focused on our mind on the fact that there are problems that we've been hiding under the carpet for far too long.
Yes, this would be also my wish for the future, that we really start thinking and dealing as a more openly with this kind of problems and the questions, so not ignoring the question, not ignoring voices coming from different communities and different parts of our societies, but really start dealing with them and go into the conversation, take up the questions and try to find together some answers.